Hello and welcome. It's so good to be able to be with you at this year's Ecclesia conference. My name is Kate Middleton and I'm a psychologist, a church leader, and I'm one of the directors of the Mind and Soul Foundation. We're a national organisation passionate about this whole area of mental and emotional well-being. And that's not just about illness, it's about what it means to do life really well, to truly flourish and to release the best from your body and your brain, to look after your mind. And as leaders, that's so important that we think about those things both for the people we're caring for and leading, but also for ourselves. And this has been a really challenging season for everyone in terms of mental and emotional well-being. Because of course, way back in March 2020, everything changed and your mind uses rhythm and routine and predictability to keep your stress level low. So when we entered pandemic, everyone's baseline stress level was raised. And there's two reasons that that's a problem. Firstly, because emotions like anxiety and frustration operate on the same physiological system as stress. So if your baseline is raised, little things that wouldn't usually bother you at all start to feel like big things emotionally. They start to trigger challenging emotions. And of course, this season has been emotionally challenging anyway. Things like loss and grief and anxiety and frustration, already so much part of our daily pattern. So managing the impact of emotions like this has become a significant challenge. The second reason, though, is that we all have a crisis level. It doesn't matter how brilliant you are, how experienced as a leader, how deep your faith is, your mind has limits. And when the level on that physiological system gets too high, it literally means your capacity to cope, your mind's ability to manage what is being thrown at it is about to be exceeded. You are entering the overwhelm zone. And that changes how your mind works because it goes into a kind of emergency mode in order to save any remaining capacity in case anything else happens so that you can focus on the most crucial things. And your analytical thinking brain is switched right down. So it's hard to think clearly or problem solve or concentrate or be creative. And your brain does its best to try to get you to remove yourself from the situation. So particularly in acute moments of pressure and challenge, you feel this sense of panic, this overwhelming, suffocating, emotional feeling. And you may find thoughts going into your head like, I can't do this, or I need to get out. You just don't feel like yourself. And the problem is, stress isn't just about distress. Any season that's demanding raises that stress level, not just in the short term, but over a longer season. And in this season, if we're honest, many of us have been living on the edge of overwhelm for months because of constant uncertainty, constant change, and unusual demand. I want to talk to you today a little bit about one of my favourite New Testament stories, and I think one of the most evocative for this season. And I want to draw out of that some challenges to us as leaders particularly, and ask you, what do you think is the most important leadership skill for you to be developing in a time like this, in such an unusual moment in the world's history, in humanity's history, and in your history as a leader? And the story is Matthew 14. It's the culmination of a stressful and demanding day. And Jesus has heard the terrible news that John the Baptist has been killed. And when he tries to retreat to get some space to process that, to deal with the implications and the emotions of that moment, thousands of people follow him, asking him to speak to them and teach. It's a familiar challenge for us as leaders, isn't it? You know, Jesus is trying to get time for himself, but he's literally pursued by people who need something from him. They're depending on him for inspiration, for hope, for wisdom, for guidance. And it turns out they didn't even bring dinner. So Jesus has to pull off the feeding of the 5,000 after he's taught them. And finally, when the people then disperse, it seems he's still really needing that personal time, the headspace time, the space and peace to connect with God, because he tells the disciples to get into a boat and cross the Sea of Galilee while he goes off into the hills to pray. And it's interesting because the disciples are clearly not keen to go. The language used tells us that Jesus has to compel them. I mean, he's not literally shoving them into the boat, but it's pretty close. As seasoned sailors, these guys knew the lake was renowned for winds and storms that blew up in the night. They would have heard legends of ghosts and mysterious sightings on the lake at night. And in fact, in general, the people were very wary of the potential power of water at that time. The Hebrew root word for water is the same as their root word for chaos. Jesus literally compels the disciples in this moment to sail into what they know is likely to be chaos, uncertainty, challenge. Does that sound familiar? Sometimes life, and in particular leadership, takes us into uncertain waters. And not unexpectedly, in this story, things do get tough for the disciples. They end up fighting against a strong wind. It's a moment that's physically tough and demanding, but more than that, it's emotionally exhausting. And although that's just the demand, it's also something about the relentlessness, the drawn-out nature of this ordeal. Matthew tells us they've come a long way, but they know they still have a long way to go. It's in the darkest moment, the furthest from light and dawn and relief. That's when Jesus turns up. And he walks across the water to his friends who are cowering in the boat. And we know they're overwhelmed and full of panic, that their minds have shut down because at first they don't even recognize him. And Jesus says to them, "Do not fear." So what is Jesus saying to them in that moment? What's our learning from this for us as leaders in our own journeys? Is he saying to them that they're wrong to be anxious and exhausted? Does this mean that for us to do life and leadership really well, we should somehow bypass human emotions? Because that's what our culture tells us, isn't it? Our secular culture says that to become better leaders, we should become cleverer, more brilliant, higher capacity. We should sleep less, work more, take on more, become more efficient. We want to believe we can make ourselves limitless, invincible. But no, the important thing to understand about this story lies in the Greek word that's used. When Jesus says to them, "Do not fear," he's referring to a very specific kind of fear. It's a Greek word that isn't referring to anxiety. In this situation, actually, anxiety would be a normal and very healthy human reaction. You can't eradicate human anxiety, and you shouldn't want to. It's part of the brilliant way that your brain works. The word Jesus uses here refers to a specific kind of fear. It's the kind we experience when we feel like we can't cope with what the moment is throwing at us. The kind when we feel totally overwhelmed, like our capacity to manage has been exceeded, that we're in over our heads and the only option is to run. This is a story about overwhelm. And what Jesus wants the disciples to know is that they don't need to feel that overwhelm. They don't need to feel the sense of panic. What he says to them is not a reprimand, it's a reassurance. He says, it's okay. You don't need to run. You can do this. You're not going to drown. And why? Jesus wants to teach them something very important in this moment about life and leadership, particularly in chaos and uncertainty and storms and difficulty. And it's about where we draw our courage and strength from. Because he says to them, "Take courage, don't be afraid. I am here." And what Jesus does in that moment is he actually uses a Greek phrase that to them would have been very familiar. We don't use it in our UK culture, really. We tend to say in challenging situations, "good luck," But actually in some other cultures, they say something slightly different. I spent some time living in France, and in France, if someone's having an exam or an interview or something, you don't say good luck. You say bon courage, literally take courage, be of good courage. What that means is the key to the outcome isn't just pure dumb luck. It's about drawing something from within yourself. It's gaining confidence because you know you've got this. And Jesus uses a very similar phrase in this moment, but as so often Jesus does, he just changes one slight detail. He says to them, take courage, but not because you're drawing on your own inner strength. He says they can take courage because he is with them. They can draw from something that isn't about human brilliance. It's about something bigger, something better, something beyond themselves. It's drawing on the brilliance that comes from our connection with God. You know, so much of what is tough in this season is the uncomfortable realization that we are so close to the limits of ourselves as human beings. In a culture where we like to think we could make ourselves invincible, COVID has made us realize we're really not. We are so close to the limits of our cleverness, of our control, forced to realize that our entire lives can be stopped by a tiny virus that could defeat us. We're close to the limits of our capacity after a year practically of pandemic and lockdown and restriction. We're all so exhausted. We're hitting the limits of our creativity as we can't think of ways to keep doing this any longer. The challenge of keeping normal life going under abnormal pressure is becoming increasingly hard. So what do you do when the world around you is chaos and the storm isn't something you can solve or control? I love what happens next. Peter, wonderful, impetuous, do it now, think later Peter. He realizes the enormous potential of what Jesus is saying. You know, if we can draw on something that's beyond ourselves, if we can harness God's power, God's cleverness, God's capacity, God's creativity, God's control, we could do anything. And Peter realizes this, so he says to Jesus, if it's really you, if you really mean that, call me. And he steps out of the boat and he walks out on the water towards Jesus. He does something he should never have been able to do, certainly not under his own human strength and cleverness. And he does it, remember, not on a calm day in the daylight with the sun glimmering on the water. No, he steps into darkness and wind and waves and mayhem. But then there's this wonderful human moment that kicks in because Peter is fine when his eyes are on Jesus, but it's like his human mind is screaming at him. Are you crazy? Look at the wind and the rain and the waves and it's dark, and it's like his brain wins and his attention is shifted from the spiritual back down to ground level. He takes his eyes off Jesus and he's suddenly terrifyingly aware he is out of his depth. How is he even doing this? He can't do this. And he begins to sink, literally, because he's walking on water, but also emotionally, he's sinking into panic and overwhelm. And this is so often the chaos, the tension of these chaos moments, isn't it? It's definitely been a feature of this season. In the most challenging moments, we feel out of our depth because we are out of our depth. We are facing things we cannot control through our humanity. We don't have the answers to some of what this season is throwing at us. We can't do it in our own strength, but if we can keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, if we can draw something bigger and better than ourselves, we can pull off things that otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. But in those moments when overwhelm kicks in, it can leave us feeling like we're drowning and that we almost can't breathe under the weight of it. We're caught between our humanity and our limits and God's spirituality, his limitless power and potential, but our limited ability to trust in it and have the faith to hold our focus on God. It's the fight not to be distracted by our own fears. In this moment, leading into a storm in the middle of darkness and challenge, Jesus wants the disciples to learn a vital lesson. They do have limits, but that's okay. Because in moments when they reach the edge of themselves, that's when they can learn to reach out to God. And that means that those moments are not about peril, they're about possibility. because that's when God's power can be released. When Peter feels like he's sinking, his instinct is perfect because he cries out to God. He immediately shifts his focus back, and Jesus doesn't hesitate. Again, no reprimand. He just reaches out and lifts Peter back to safety and security and calm. As leaders, we need to recognise that perhaps our most important leadership skill in this moment and in tough moments is not about capacity or cleverness or making ourselves more brilliant or going on another course or reading another book. It is our ability to hold our nerves in times of chaos, to find and carry peace instead of pressure and panic, to learn how to root ourselves in something beyond ourselves. Because we will be called to lead people who depend on us in those stormy times, who, like Jesus, may follow us, looking for inspiration and wisdom and hope, needing us to carry something so much more than just our human ideas. In John 16:33, Jesus shares a great piece of wisdom with his disciples. He says, "In this world you will have trouble, but," he says, "take heart, I have overcome the world." Again, I love the intentionality of the Greek words that's used in John's Gospel when he shares what Peter says. It's not a weak, passive sort of, hey, chill out, it'll be fine. It's a proactive, decisive, take heart, literally, take hold of your emotions. It's not quite saying get a grip, but it's pretty close. It's recognizing that in those moments, the initial emotion may not be a choice. That's being human. But our decision over what we do next, that is something that we can take control over. So here are 3 practical things I think you might need to think about in this moment as part of doing that. And number 1 is pace. Avoiding overwhelm is so often about maths. We think resilience is something clever. It's a kind of superhuman skill, making ourselves sort of, superhuman leaders, like Teflon superheroes who can handle anything and never ever struggle. But that's not real. I mean, it certainly isn't human. Think about it. Jesus was God in the human brain and body that he designed, and he was without sin. He was perfection in who he was and how he handled life as a human, including handling the limitations and the emotional reality of what it was to be human. Remember the story of Jesus entering the temple in Jerusalem and seeing the money changers cheating the vulnerable, his fury and how he overturns the tables and drives them out. Only Mark records a vital detail, that Jesus actually first stepped into the temple the night before. Mark 11:11 says, "Since it was already late, Jesus went back to Bethany with the disciples. He rested, he relaxed, presumably he had dinner, he hung out a bit. He came back the next day to deal with this situation that so badly needed his attention." Sometimes avoiding overwhelm is about choosing how and when we do things. It's about pacing ourselves, recognizing we're more likely to become overwhelmed when we're tired, when we're vulnerable, when other things have happened that have made us already emotional, lifted the level on that physiological baseline. So taking good time out, having good boundaries between work and downtime really matter in seasons that are challenging. But the most important thing may be deciding not to do something in a moment when we feel instinctively like we so want to deal with it right there and then, choosing not to act straight away. The second thing is about priorities. And this is about who do you put first? As leaders, most of us are really practiced about thinking about the needs of the people we support and care for, thinking creatively about how to do that, reaching out to them proactively, making sure they know they're loved and not forgotten, sustaining them, lifting their mood when they most need it. The question is, when did you do any of those things for you? If you don't keep yourself going, you cannot keep other people going. If you sink, they might sink too. In Mark 6, he tells the story of the same very busy day that culminates in Jesus walking across the water to his distressed disciples. And the disciples had just returned from their own mission in pairs, teaching people about Jesus. And there were so many people around that they couldn't even get a meal with Jesus. And what we see is Jesus deliberately and determinately prioritizing their well-being. He walks away from people who are in need to find and make quiet space for them to rest and eat. You know, it's okay to prioritize your own well-being. In fact, it's vital that you do. Jesus knew the importance of this. Maybe he knew that later that day they would face a battle and needed their energy. What things keep you going? What lifts your mood? How are you kind to yourself? Maybe you need to recognize that the most important thing you do this week to care for other people might be something you do to care and sustain yourself. And the third P is perspective. Because the most crucial thing is that in moments when the world around us feels in chaos, that darkness and despair feels so very powerful, the question is, how do we keep our eyes on Jesus? You know, in a season like global pandemic, our challenge isn't one of creativity or cleverness or problem solving, working out how to solve it. You can't solve global pandemic. This is about trust and patience and how we sustain ourselves, learning to tread water while we wait for the tide to turn, because we know we can trust in God's bigger story, that change will come, that better times are ahead. Jesus nails it in John 16:33. We can take heart because we know ultimately he has overcome the world. Literally what he says there is, I will prevail, or more simply, I will win. The human stories that we hear in the media may be depressing, distressing, anxiety-provoking, make us feel cynical and mistrustful, but there is a better story playing out here if we lift our eyes. This is not the end of humanity's story. And our decisive, determined, sometimes defiant decision to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, to continually and repeatedly return our focus to God in moments when the world becomes so attention-grabbing and dominant. That enables us to lead the people that we do, to keep them going, to sustain not just ourselves, but them as well. We need to make a distinctive decision about our perspective. Let's take a moment just to pray about these things I've shared today. Lord God, we thank you for your power and your presence with us. We thank you that we can trust in you, that we are rooted and established in you, not in the things of this world. We thank you for the amazing truth that in our weakness, your power is released to its greatest extent. Help us to be wise in this season of pressure. Help us to make good choices for ourselves, for those we love, and the people we lead. Help us learn lessons for now, but also for the future. Help us to release your power and potential to its greatest extent, to grow the kingdom of God on earth as in heaven. In the name of Jesus. Amen.